Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis-Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
In this episode, Wendy Aris will be joined with Dr. Sébastien Rioux, who is an associate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Montreal. He holds the Canada Research Chair in the Political Economy of Food and Well-Being, and is a member of CERIUM and CRE. He has published, with M. Taylor, Introduction to Global Labour Studies, Quebec, Presses de l'Université du Québec, 2018, and Global Labour Studies, Cambridge Polity, 2017. We will be discussing the article, Slavery, Capitalism, and Imperialism, Its Impact in the Caribbean. So let's have a listen.
Thank you so much, Professor Rioux, for coming on to the podcast, Dis-Affamie History, to speak about your paper on slavery, capitalism, and imperialism. And before we start, can I just have you just do a brief introduction of yourself?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Sébastien Rioux, and I'm professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Montreal in Quebec, Canada.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And we'll start. And then what would you say the connections do you make between, I guess, these forces within slavery, capitalism, and imperialism? Would you be able to kind of summarize that?
Yeah, of course. So the main point of the paper, I guess, was there were three aspects to it, very much to talk about the close relationship between slavery and capital accumulation on the one hand. At the same time, look at the role of slavery as an early form of scientific management. In other words, as almost a laboratory of an experimentation in terms of labor control and labor exploitation that was extremely important for Europe as a whole. And thirdly, look at the destruction of the slave system itself, not as something that was, let's say, meant to be, but instead that was fought the whole way through as a political process, really, that was based on the resistance and struggles of slaves themselves. So the idea of the paper is to give a very large summary of about 300 to 400 years, but the idea being to look at slavery, capitalism, and imperialism not as three different things, but really as, let's say, as an integrated whole that within which, in fact, slavery played a massive role.
Yes, definitely. Just to show that interconnectedness between all of those three themes, and then how that relays back into this particular region where this is the kind of almost like the basis of things. So, how did, the enslaved labor contribute to, I guess, to the financial and industrial growth for European imperial powers?
So as you can imagine, this has been an issue that has been hotly debated for a long time with different schools of thought, some arguing that it played very little role, others actually arguing the contrary. I would say that most historians today and economists would not argue against the idea that it did play a massive role. I would probably would probably argue that, in fact, slavery probably played from an economic perspective, probably played a greater role in the 19th century, in fact. In other words, that when it was abolished was probably the most lucrative that it ever were in history. That being said, there are a lot of historians and economists who have done a great job of making the connection between all this. Clearly, we have data in terms of investment, all the slave trade and all those ventures were probably the most profitable investment at their time. So clearly for the late 17 and throughout the 18th century, the slave trade would yield higher returns than most domestic investment, in fact. So in other words, people with capital, with people with money would have quite an incentive, in fact, to invest in in the slave trade itself. And average profit could reach up to 50%. Like that, quite a lot compared to investment. And generally speaking, I mean, mostly depending on the period, the time, and so on and so forth. You can, and also the country, it could be between 20, 25, 30% as a rough average. But that being said, investors were looking forward to these, say, opportunities. I would even say that throughout the 18th century, one of the reasons why the trade became so not only profitable but also became so important is also part of the reason is that the British Empire was quite good at, let's say, stabilizing the whole trade, so making it much less risky through insurance schemes and so on and so forth, like ships dedicated to the slave trade. So the professionalization of the trade itself meant that, in fact, it became even more something that was not only profitable, but also less risky as a whole. So at that level, clearly for investor at home, huge return on investment in general. For planters, many of them return home with massive amount of money. They were often out. Some of them would return after like even 15, 20 years. They would plow back part of their capital in like luxury goods. So that many of them would just buy themselves into the aristocratic society. But we know that a lot of them actually invested their capital back home in different ventures. So they held government bonds, mining and maritime undertakings. They would buy land, sometimes in land and improvement schemes for agriculture, but also land for development in terms of housing developments at a moment where England, for instance, was going through its own industrial revolution, high rates of urbanization, that kind of stuff. Some of them, even later, obviously later in the 19th century, many of them invested in railways and so on and so forth. So it's very hard to know exactly what happened with all their fortunes, especially because it's very often from a purely archival perspective. We don't always have access to all those like family archives, or that's another issue. But still, like what has been seen from this is the extent to which, in fact, they were quite interested in using this capital to reinvest it to make further capital outside of slavery. Many of them reinvested on their own plantations to expand the plantations to have a much bigger operation, so to speak. But others saw that the profit generated by the slaves as, in fact, an opportunity to invest in other ventures. And that it's not only under the British Empire. You see this also with Cuban planters returning to Barcelona, investing there, and so on and so forth. French planters as well, the same thing. So it's pretty obvious, I would say, that like what you see is the expansion, like the role of slavery in the expansion of world trade. And I would say that's probably the main role that it played here is precisely the expansion of the world trade by favoring home industries through export-led growth, because a lot of these colonies where plantations would massively import manufactured goods and so on and so forth. So they kind of fuel in many ways an industrial revolution, or at the very least a wage labor oriented economy at home, so to speak. So they were key to the whole process, precisely because they generated capital, they generated demand, but also supported in many ways huge number of people that were, and increasingly, in fact, when you think about all those employed in the banks, the insurance companies, when you think about the seamen, the longshoremen, the different agents throughout this, so that we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people and more. So there's a whole economy that was being built around that, and in fact, an expanding Atlantic economy.
No, definitely. And then the fact that you just mentioned in terms of, trying to find in terms of the archival documentation when it comes to specific families and stuff like that, that gets a little bit more micro and more really leaning in to see how that, impacts the greater society, which is quite fascinating from what I've seen as well. And what would you say in terms for the economic theories or frameworks do you draw on to analyze part of this, slavery's impact on capitalism? I know you mentioned some of it.
Yeah, of course. As I mentioned at the beginning of the paper, and it's probably an oversimplification, but tendency has always been to either deny the connection between slavery and capitalism, and this you don't, even some schools of Marxism have been going down that road. And at the other hand, you have the other school of thought which is no, slavery and capitalism are not at all incompatible. It's not an issue of whether it's necessary or not. It's just to say there's no contradiction in terms. At different time, at different moment, in different political context, slavery can thrive, and in fact, it did at a moment in human history where industrial capitalism was, in fact, becoming widespread, global, truly. So I obviously draw on the second school of thought. For me, it's very hard to dissociate these two things. I draw more from a Marxist perspective, but one that is much more open to these kind of differences. So I'm not, obviously, there's the sort of theories, even very little now, this is more of a historical approach, like the kind of dissociation between capitalism and slavery, very much linked historically with Adam Smith and others who in many ways saw slavery as let's say unproductive, let's say, form of labor, which is obviously historically not untrue, but it was much more ideologically driven than it was factually, let's say, anchored. But I draw from let's say, a loose Marxist perspective for which the expansion of capitalism is impossible without that peculiar moment.
For sure. And then I guess now we're going down to the other side of things to say, to what extent was the abolition of slavery a moral versus an economic decision?
Yeah, this is a very good question, because this is another kind of debate that has been ongoing, even though the positions are not as, let's say, strong as they used to be. But obviously, you had people arguing that from a moral perspective, like the abolition of slavery was in fact the realization by a few enlightened Englishmen in the late 18th century, being able to organize, plead their case, make a case for the humanity of Black people and other slaves, and not, in other words, very much the savior here is still the white man. So it's not to say that it didn't play a role. I think it was really important in many ways, but obviously it removes, or it doesn't give any agency to the millions and millions of people who went through this horrific experience. On the other hand, you have, and that's probably a stream of Marxism in the, let's say, mid 20th century, much more economistic and deterministic in theory. So it saw the abolition of slavery as something that was the outgrow of industrial capitalism itself. In other words, that irrespective of slave rebellions and agency, and irrespective of moral principles or what have you, it was the system itself that gave up on that form of labor.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, the kind of moral versus, as you mentioned, moral versus economic aspect is very much in the position between, let's say, conjunctural versus structural cause. Like, how do we explain the abolition of slavery? I think nowadays a more integrated approach is much more interesting to see how, in fact, not only that slavery was profitable throughout the 19th century. That was never the question. And as I mentioned earlier, in fact, it's probably even more profitable than it ever were, with the expansion of the kind of cotton kingdom in the US South and elsewhere in Cuba and Brazil. So, in fact, some would argue, and that's part of the thesis of Robin Blackburn more recently with the Reckoning, that in fact we are talking about the relative importance of wage labor being much cheaper in a sense. So that doesn't mean that slave labor, in fact, slavery was still very much profitable, did not, and probably even more and more every year. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, the wage laborer or wage labor form of exploitation became a politically more interesting compromise at the time. That's one way of explaining it. I would not buy the thing entirely. I still think for this to make sense, it means that you need slaves to not behave. In other words, you need to make the system not interesting at all. So you need people to the slave struggle needs to be there, and it was always there. So
yeah, it's just showing the domination of what they were trying to extract out of individuals. And so, how would you say, I guess, how did imperialism facilitate and sustain this whole global capitalist expansion?
Well, from an imperial perspective, it was always about, as it is today, it was always about having control over space, over specific territories, over specific economies, having access to certain resources, and therefore, as to boost the production at home and so on and so forth. So the imperial nature of the whole system was essential it would not, especially because it evolved in a way that all the metropolis were actually controlling different spaces, different access to different resources, and they made sure that those islands, those spaces, were very much connected to the imperial economy in and of itself. So it's in many ways it's a war economy, but at the same time very much dependent on the wealth that is produced on the margins. That's why I've always found a bit the idea of the margin to be a difficult one in a sense, at least one that comes from colonial language, because those margins were actually at the very core of those empire. It would have been impossible for those national economies, so to speak, to even think of being like to have this level of wealth and power without those colonies, clearly.
Yeah, definitely. And then how would you say, I know you kind of alluded to it before, but how would you say, or how did the enslaved people resist and challenge the economic structures that were imposed on them?
Yeah, well, this is a very long history, and was probably one of the most, obviously it's one of the most important of the whole thing, because you have to remember, because it's too easy to talk about slavery as if slaves were commodities, because they were, but at the same time they are humans, and it means that the commodity that can produce more wealth for the owner can also refuse to make more wealth for the owner. So that there's a core contradiction within the whole system. And we see it very early on, like at the beginning of the journey, so to speak. Slave ship rebellions, most of them, like in fact the majority of them, occurred on the African coast. So even before departing, slave ship rebellions happen. The majority of them happen on the African coast, and they would, during the Middle Passage, you still have a lot of them, much less, but still. And by the time they arrive in the Americas, in many ways, the slave ship and the whole organization of the slave ship had not completely crushed the spirit of revolt, but it was part of the whole idea. And this is quite important. It's like, if you want to beat down a human to a commodity, you have actually to dehumanize these individuals. Once on the plantation, the amount of struggle was huge. In fact, and I mentioned three forms. The first one is like the daily struggles, and it's by far the most important in terms of it was universally practiced. So this is very subtle, this is less visible, but it's day-to-day resistance. So negotiating and renegotiating the terms of bondage, just making it feel a bit more comfortable, winning concessions, for instance. So many slaves would try to have planters promoting family, so that they would actually have a sense of home and companionship, and have, like, reclaim humanity within this system. They would ask to have access to provision grounds, to grow food, to have like animals, again reclaiming some form of agency and liberty and like choice. Some of them would also ask for what we could call rights, like with inverted quote, of course, but funeral rights, also going to the market. Some of them had the right to go to the market, sell some of the veggies, for instance, that they had grown for money. So they would always try to push back against the structure. Obviously, sometimes planters would give up, or at least would give some concessions, at least to prevent rebellions. But at any rate, even when that was not enough, or when the planters refused any accommodation, so to speak, there was like politics of retaliation, sabotage, theft, destruction of goods, abortion, committing suicide, slowing down the pace of work. So slaves were very much agent in this old system. Simply that the fact that we don't necessarily have perfect records and so on and so forth does not diminish the importance of these like daily struggles. So that's one form of pushing back against the system. The second one is the running of slaves, and here you have two broad ways of doing this. The first one is petit marronnage. Petit marronnage is escaping for 1 or 2 days, perhaps a week, but very much linked to, let's say, visiting lovers and family members, finding work, festivals, religious ceremonies, drinking even, of course, and just simply to feel free. They would usually not go too far from the plantation, and many would actually come back without much punishment. In certain instances, planters more or less accepted that it was part of the deal. Obviously, it depends in which context. It depends which planters and so on and so forth. But it shows again the capacity of slaves to create something that is not entirely determined by a system of exploitation of that magnitude. And the other part of the running of slaves was the grand marronage. The grand marronage is this obviously entailed the intention never to return. And here, as I mentioned, it's physical geography it mattered a lot. Like, is the plantation on an island? Is this island close to another one from a different imperial power? Are you living on the mainland? What's surrounding the plantation? Like mountains, plains, forests, and so on and so forth. So that was extremely important in terms of like the options that you had, especially when the let's say the planters and the authorities were after you. And the third main form of, let's say, of resistance, which that was comparatively rare, was a rebellion. Mm-hmm. And this kind of insurrections were obviously really talked a lot about, but in the grand scheme of things, they didn't happen as often as the other two ones that I mentioned before. And here, the insurrections with even like more than 1,000 rebels would be very few. Everything was about organizing and the difficulties of organizing that many slaves coming often from different backgrounds, speaking different languages, fearing perhaps the consequences of it, and so on. So, and one interesting aspect of those rebellions is that they were very often organized by the kind of like elite slaves, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So those who would have the right to go outside the plantations, who actually spoke probably more than one language, and who could more easily, they were more socially, culturally more mobile, and physically more mobile as well. So very interesting economy of resistance here that like played at every level of the kind of experience of being in such a labor exploitative environment.
No, definitely. And just what you mentioned, especially with what are known, I guess, as the slave gardens, that being leveraged as well. The next thing is just, were there alternative economic models that could have emerged in the absence of slavery and imperialism in this period?
Once the British Empire, the slave trade, it almost automatically started looking for a different type of labor, indentured labor. Mm-hmm. Indentured labor, few years after the end of slavery itself in the British Empire, grew up exponentially. So there was a need for bounded labor in one way or another. Mm. And indentured labor is this kind of, it's not slave labor. It's kind of temporary slave labor in a sense. The idea being that like you will be working for someone for a certain number of years, usually 5 years, and you have no right to leave. You have no right to find another master or whatsoever. And the idea being that at the end of your contract, because it's sort of a contract, you retrieve your liberty, and then the state could, for instance, give you a plot of land or something like this. That's the beautiful idea that was supposed to happen throughout, but that's very rarely what happened. Many indentured labor actually were worked to death. They had to work like 16, 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. So and even for those who ended up finishing their contracts, many did not have access to a plot of land, or if the state like gave them something, it was a plot of land that was not necessarily very, very good for agriculture. So basically a lot of problems. But what we see is from the late 1830s onwards, especially within the British system, massive amount of indentured labor throughout the empire to supply the need, the labor required for the system to go on. Could there have been another labor? I mean, during the 19th century, you see the rise, obviously, of labor, of like what we call free labor, so quote unquote, but of wage labor, and part of the reason is also linked to a mass, more and more immigration from Europe to the Americas. So, and they will not accept slavery or indentured labor. So there's obviously a social hierarchy in terms of labor, but it's one of the main source driving the rise of let's say wage labor within the colonies and outside the European powers.
Mm-hmm. No, as I said, it's just very interesting, very fascinating. I know, Professor Rio, you mentioned in regards to financial institutions, but what role did financial institutions such as banks and insurance company play in maintaining slavery?
Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot these days about finance and but finance is absolutely not new. You need banks and insurance companies and financial capital has always been important for trade, at least from medieval times onwards. And the slave trade, as I mentioned earlier, was very much organized by the stability provided by the banks and the insurance companies. So you had people with money, obviously, who would invest in those ventures. So the idea being that they win or lose together.
Mm-hmm.
But very early on, the whole system adapt in a way that, for instance, insurance companies, they become much more important to secure losses. You see, at the same time, you see how much is a kind of a win-win situation is that at the same time that like those organizing the trade are trying to make it more stable and less risky, then insurance companies are ready to come in precisely because they know that they will not be losing one time out of three. So there is a trade that is well known, that they have professionals throughout the chain, from the seaman to those organizing the trade on the coast of Africa, to those financing all these ventures. So they it's not simply that they played an important role. They were central to the whole apparatus. And I would even go further by saying that there were no planters in the New World, so to speak, that was not heavily in debt to a creditor, to a bank, a merchant. So merchant banks were extremely involved in the whole in the whole economy of like either the slave trade or slavery or both, and all the goods that were produced. So all the circulation of people, goods, and money were in one way or another circling back to those financial institutions. The Barclays in England are very well known for being rooted in the exploitation of black people. So through the slave trade and slavery. So those institutions were key. Without that backing, the whole system would have crumbled. It would have been impossible. They made sure that planters had the necessary money for the next season until their merchants brought back the commodities home, and so on and so forth. So they would oil the machine, so to speak. That was very much how it worked.
Mm-hmm. No, it's just about mitigating risk, and as you said, just to make it as safe as possible in order to invest, right? To make sure the wheel continued onwards. And I guess in terms of your work, how does it inform or continue with the current discussions on reparations for slavery?
Well, I have not written specifically on reparations for slavery, so it would be hard for me to go too far on that. But I would say that from a historical perspective, clearly we have more and more data and information on the impact of this whole economy and the Atlantic economy on Afro-descendant people and also people from other communities, because the we're talking about slavery more specifically, but obviously a lot of Indians as well were moved to the Caribbeans but for the specifically for reparations, for me, I think it's obvious to I mean, even the U.S. From purely from a U.S. perspective, the like the it's so fresh in some ways. It's so fresh. So there is a sense of in which the reparations for slavery is the history very much demonstrate what quite clearly, I would say, the importance of reparation. Now, like in everything, it's a political decision. It has nothing to do with. That's why the Barclays and other financial institutions have apologized a few years ago after the Floyd movement. But obviously, this is not out of empathy. It's out of fear of economic coercion or like impact on their profit margins, which is a very wrong way of looking at the question. But so yeah, I don't think I can go further than that, because I mean, like on that at that level, I have not made all the connections in terms of like what would be, because there are very specific debates on how to calculate, how to. So I would leave this to more competent people.
No, thank you so much for that. And then, in what ways does the history of slavery and imperialism, impact the contemporary racial and economic inequalities?
Well, again, this is very well documented, but for me, there are, let's say, two things that like comes to mind right away for sure is like racism. Racism is not some sort of marginal category in society. It is still very much informed by hundreds of years of domination and exploitation, of dehumanizing Afro-descendant people, with the consequence that some up to this day, like the way that people relate and talk about the world is very much organized around those social hierarchies. So it's very, for me, it's the most important, perhaps, in terms of it's probably even more, how to say, it's more subtle now and in many ways, because there's like formal equality and formal and rights and so on and so forth. But the reality is that when you look at from a either political, economic, or cultural perspective, clearly that equality is on paper. The other thing, which is, I mean, you see it like clearly linked with racism, but the U.S. throughout the Americas is the only society that does not outlaw slavery formally. They in their amendment to the Constitution, when they ban slavery, it continues existing, except so it's banned except when if there is a criminal offense, in which case slavery becomes the slave owner, so to speak. And again, it's not, data is quite obvious. Is you don't need to be a very biased person just so that when you look at the data, you realize that the Black population is by far overrepresented. So for me, at least, this is another form of control, another form of spatially controlling a certain part of a certain population on the territory. That's obviously, I'm speaking specifically for the U.S., but I would say that racism as a whole has this tendency to, in fact, control where people can go in space, where they are, because obviously we're talking about more like social space and so on and so forth. But racism will do this, will make it, we will find it strange that let's say Black population they live in this neighborhood, or that they go to this school, so this is exactly what control means of someone's body.
Thank you so much for that example. And, did you, while researching this paper, did you face any challenges in tracing these economic histories through historical documents?
As you can imagine, there are whole libraries that have been written on slavery, the slave trade, and with all the kind of the different aspects to it. It's a huge, huge, huge literature, and nobody can really do justice to the importance. It's physical importance. Mm-hmm. I did not do any specific archives for that one piece of writing, but obviously most of the people that I'm relying on actually went through the archives and did the hard work of looking at like thousands and thousands of pages of reports and so on. So, but I would say anybody who is interested in these issues, I would say first, like for me, it's less a matter of the archives, because like it's more largely the field. There's just so much stuff. It's at the same time, it also means that it's in many ways it's a very accessible topic. In other words, if you want to find stuff on this, like it's not going to be too difficult. At the same time, a lot of debates, like specific debates about the economic importance or not, and then we enter in more minute arguments. But at the same time, no, so nothing specifically difficult, but still the volume, it's just a lot of but still important, clearly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. And then of course, what new directions do you see for the future on this type of research for capitalism, slavery, and imperialism?
Yeah. The first thing that is quite obvious to me, coming from, I live in Quebec, so French is my first language, but it's it's the domination of work on either the British Empire or the US. Yeah. It's just, you don't have that level of details for other European powers. And I would say, and obviously there are literatures on the Portuguese in Brazil and the Spanish in Latin America, but at the end of the day, not a lot has been translated. So there's an issue of language. At the same time, there's also a lot of people, even for whom, like, even if English is not their first language, that they would have access to these other literature that will actually work on more British oriented stuff, or US history and so on. So that's, for me, that's the new directions. One of them would be to make it, to broaden a bit more the inquiries. It was quite, even though there are debates, and even though it was not easy to find data on, let's say, the economic importance of slavery for the British Empire, when you look at France or other European powers, it's even less. So it's more difficult to have, let's say, a very well-informed opinion on the overall history of these colonial powers. So clearly that is one aspect for me. The Atlantic history is very much still, in many ways, to me at least, a British Atlantic history. And I do not diminish the importance of the Brits in the Atlantic, especially the Caribbeans, but in North America, but that's not the whole story, for sure.
No, definitely. And as we come to a close, Professor, what would you say are some of the lessons that can be drawn from capitalism, slavery, and imperialism?
Well, it's a good question, because it's probably too easy to get lost in translation and then just say, you know what, this happened, it's in the past, and then we should just be careful not to repeat that and blah blah blah. But now in the world, the ILO, the International Labor Organization, according to their estimations, there are about 50 million slaves in the world today. Most people would probably say that it's a quite conservative estimate. All this to say that slavery never disappeared. It just became, let's say that it became perhaps less relative to the economy. It became less important, but it never disappeared. And what we see is that for about 40 years, slavery is in fact rising, and this is linked to poverty, insecurity, harsher measures in terms of mobility. So, like all the laws against like migration and so on and so forth. So I mean, for me, one of the lessons is like not to forget that that slavery is not incompatible with the economic system we live in. In other words, it not only does it still exist, but I would say that in many ways it is some forms of them even continue today within what we would call like advanced capitalist societies with democracy and so on and so forth. So in Canada, we have kind of a migrant worker program, which is we're not in slavery. We're much closer to what with indentured labor would have looked like. But in other words, we have about 60,000 people entering the country on a yearly basis, having absolutely no right to mobility in the labor market. They come here to work for one employer only. And if they have issues with that employer, they have to leave the country, reapply to the program, and try to re-enter. This is a huge imbalance in terms of power relations. And basically, it denies what is and should be, let's say, from a purely economic perspective, let's say the idea that free labor, at least the only freedom that you have is that at very least you can choose your own exploiter. Those people don't even have the right to mobility in the labor market. And I would say that most migrant worker program in the world today are going, if they are not there, they are definitely going in that direction. So in other words, insecurity, precarity, and very little power in terms of, and no incentive to start complaining and actually, make sure that your rights are respected and so on. So, and again, tougher measures in terms of immigration and economic difficulties a bit and poverty everywhere. I think it's like slavery and then slave-like conditions are already here, but I think they are bound to increase over the next few years.
So I just wanted to thank you so much, for coming on and to speak on this, because it is, how would I say, a very touchy subject in terms of how people want to be able to view it and to see.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.